Now we will circle back to a town we spoke of earlier. That town is Simpsonville, Kentucky. Simpsonville, founded in 1816, was established through the petition of Isaac Watkins in the same year. The town's first post office was established in 1821 in honor of Captain John Simpson, a native Virginian who represented Shelby County in the Kentucky House of Representatives and perished during the War of 1812. The town was named Simpsonville. By 1825, it had evolved into a prominent stagecoach town, ranking among the largest along the Shelbyville to Louisville route. The Midland Trail stagecoach provided a convenient stopover, allowing travelers to exchange horses and rest at the Old Stone Inn, the second oldest standing stone building in the county. It was officially incorporated in 1833. Throughout its history, Simpsonville has been predominantly an agricultural community, with dairy, tobacco, cattle, and hog farming serving as the primary sources of income for its residents. This was attributed to the town's exceptionally fertile soil, composed of limestone and red clay. Later, it became the foundation for the town's renowned moniker, American saddlebred horse capital of the world, and the Whitney M. Young Job Corps, formerly known as the Lincoln Institute. However, Simpsonville's history is also marked by a hidden chapter deeply intertwined with the brutal experiences African Americans endured during slavery. This chapter culminates in the Simpsonville Massacre, a gruesome event that occurred in 1833.
Now, let's uncover a hidden piece of Civil War history connected to Kentucky that most don't know exists. The Simpsonville Massacre. 80 colored troops of the 5th U.S. Cavalry under the command of 2nd Lieutenant Augustus Flint, a former private from Michigan, were detailed to move almost 1,000 head of cattle to Louisville from Camp Nelson, Kentucky. Since a movement of this size could hardly have gone unnoticed, it quickly drew the attention of Confederate guerrillas. On January 24, 1865, the detachment camped 4 miles west of Shelbyville in the area of Bullskin Creek. The owner of the land allowed the troops to put the cattle in a fenced-in lot for the night, after which they pitched tents while their officers took shelter for the night in the farmhouse. One of the guerrillas was sent to scout out the strength and ability of the cattle guard. First, the scout pulled down some fence rails between the lot the herd was in and a neighbor's field of unshocked corn. Once a good part of the herd was loose in the field, the scout went to the farmhouse under the guise of a farmhand working for the neighbor. Already he knew the guerrillas band would be dealing with poorly managed troops since they'd had no pickets out. Now he had to test the full ability of their officers. Banging on the door of the farmhouse until he got an answer, the scout demanded to speak to the officer in charge of the herd. Once Lieutenant Flint was called and told of the situation, he asked the guerrilla spy what could be done. The scout realized he had gotten a real stroke of luck with this officer and played it to the hilt. First, the scout asked how many men the officer had in his command. The officer stated nearly 100 and 1,000 head of cattle. The scout suggested that the officer have the men herd out 10 head each to keep down the confusion. When the lieutenant readily agreed, the scout said he would be willing to oversee the work, but the boots he was wearing were unsuited to tramping around in the snow. To the scout's surprise, the officer told the scout he would loan his own boots if the scout would take care of the situation. The scout took the boots and left, surely laughing under his breath about the stupidity of the officer. After rousting the troops, he sped off. His mission was fulfilled beyond his wildest dreams. The scout would report the exact number of troops, their condition, and the fact that they would be extra tired from running down the cattle herd in the dark. The most enjoyable part, however, would be telling his story of the gullible lieutenant's boots. The fateful day of January 15, 1865, arose cold, near zero, and white with snow. The officer roused his troops early to cover as much distance as possible on the short winter day. With the troops about evenly split between the front and rear of the herd, the detachment moved out for Louisville again. Since it was cold and no danger was expected, the lieutenant did not enforce as much discipline and allowed the troops to straggle along as they saw fit. Besides this, the fact was the officer dropped out of the march often to warm his nearly frozen feet in boots he had been forced to borrow from the farmer he'd spent the night with. As the soldiers and cattle moved through Simpsonville, Flint stopped in the store to again warm his feet and looked at buying some new boots. The Red Guard of the detachment was just out of sight when 15 guerrillas, supposedly led by Captain Dick Taylor, rode into town. As a citizen ran into the store with the cry of, "Here comes Taylor and his guerrillas," the lieutenant lost all interest in boots. He ran out of the back of the store and hid under the storeroom until such time as his men were dead and the guerrillas safely back on their way toward Shelbyville. The guerrillas then proceeded to terrorize the store's customers and rob them and the store of about $1,200 in money and goods. This done, Taylor and his men set out to attack the rear guard of the cattle herd. The guerrillas weren't long in catching up to the troops guarding the rear of the herd, as they were just about a half-mile out of town. Since only one of the soldiers got off a shot which missed, they probably were carrying their muskets slung. Taylor and his men rode down on them firing revolvers. Cold, tired, and never having faced combat, the troops faced insurmountable odds as panic ensued. The cattle stampeded. Startled horses turned over the wagon hauling tents and rations as the men faced this unexpected threat unguided by any officer. Some died before they could unsling their muskets. Others were shot down in cold blood as they tried to surrender. Only 2 of the 41 men escaped unharmed, one falling face down in the snow and playing dead, the other by hiding under the overturned wagon bed. The guerrillas made short work of the rear guard and seized all the weapons and ammunition from the dead and wounded troops, returning to Simpsonville within half an hour. On their return to Simpsonville, the guerrillas stopped long enough to brag about the massacre. They claimed to have killed 25 of the Negroes. One of the band, himself a black scoundrel, boasted that he had personally killed 3 of the soldiers. The killers seemed perfectly delighted with what they had accomplished. Without further injury or comment to the townspeople, they headed off in Shelbyville's general direction. At this point, Lieutenant Flint, who had cowered while his men bled and died, came out from under the store and without further thought to his boots, grabbed his horse and lit out toward Louisville. The men at Simpsonville waited just long enough to be sure the guerrillas would not return before setting out. An hour and a half after Taylor and his men entered the town for the first time, a group of citizens led by Captain Richard George arrived on the scene of the massacre. The frozen ground and glaring white snow were stained red with blood. 35 dead and wounded bodies were stretched out on and near the road. 4 more were later found, dead of wounds and or exposure. The men of Simpsonville took 20 wounded men back to town. 8 of the men so severely wounded they were not expected to live. There they were tenderly cared for by the citizens until ambulances arrived a few days later to carry them to Louisville. The men of Simpsonville also took care of the 19 dead, burying them in a long mass grave near the road where they fell. The Food Union men of Simpsonville took the time to dig a mass grave in the frozen ground. On the outskirts of Simpsonville, near modern Highway US 60R, at least 19 of the 22 who were listed as missing and reportedly killed, helping preserve the Union. Unfortunately, these soldiers had become accustomed to such brutality. Notably, a preceding battle, the First Battle of Saltville, involved Confederate raiders murdering wounded Union soldiers in their hospital beds. These types of events ultimately led to the strategy of rescuing and retreating with wounded soldiers. Overall, the men of the 5th Regiment had escaped slavery and joined the military with the hope of emancipation. However, their experiences didn't align with that of emancipation at all. Connecting to the Simpsonville Massacre is a camp further east in Kentucky, where more African American soldiers resided. They took a chance with the lives of themselves and their families with hopes of achieving freedom. Sadly, the freedom they thought they would get for their families by risking their lives was not what they had dreamed of. There are several accounts of the harsh treatment soldiers and their families went through during this transition.
November 28, 1964. I am a soldier in the service of the United States. I belong to Company 1, 124th Regiment, U.S. Colored in Infantry. When I came to Camp Nelson for the purpose of enlisting, my wife and children came with me. I was told by the officer who enlisted me that my family would be provided for in some way within the camp. In camp with another man, I built a small hut where I resided with my family. We were never notified to move until the evening of Thursday, November 24th, when the provost guard told my wife that she and her children must move out of the camp on the following morning. On Friday afternoon, November 25th, the guard came with a wagon into which they ordered my family. My wife was sick and begged that she might not be driven out into the cold. When the guard told her that, if you do not get out, we will burn the house over your head, or words to that effect. Thus threatened, my family went into the wagon and were driven outside the line. I went and searched for my family. I found them in Nicholasville, about 6 miles from camp. They were in an old building through which the rain fell. It had rained hard while they were there. My wife, consequences of exposure, was very sick. Private John Higgins, Company 1, 124th U.S. Colored Infantry.
There are several more occasions of mistreatment of soldiers' families while they went off to join the battle. When finding out such dark, twisted history, one must ask themselves, when a black soldier enlisted in the Union Army, were their families free? The answer is no. The soldiers' families were forced to leave Camp Nelson and travel elsewhere to find refuge amidst a war. Over 10,000 soldiers enlisted in the Army via Camp Nelson, yet their families found no peace. Instead, they found expulsion. Over 400 refugees were expelled. Of them, 250 returned with at least 102 dying of the harsh conditions. There is an unknown fate of 150 refugees who didn't return, but they likely died due to illness and/or exposure to harsh decisions and lack of food rations. The Simpsonville Massacre, along with Camp Nelson, the Battle of Saltville, and many other battles concerning black Union soldiers. These stories are hidden beneath the constant redevelopment of Kentucky. Beneath the Renaissance of Kentucky is a bloody history involving the transition of enslaved slaves to what they thought would be their freedom. With all this in mind, we must ask, what other stories does Kentucky hold that have yet to be uncovered?
What is a nation?
Nation is family. Nation is community. Nation is men leading by example. Nation is women's support. Nation is children with role models.